In 1227, the world's greatest conqueror lay inside his tent, unaware that history was about to end differently than he planned. Genghis Khan, who had crushed kingdoms and enslaved nations, was not facing an army that night. He was facing one girl. Her name was Gurbasu, a princess of the Tangut. Her family was gone, her brothers executed her city, burned her mother, choosing death over capture. For 3 years, she lived as the Khan's concubine, a trophy of conquest. But she had been waiting. Hidden in her hair was a thin dagger passed to her in secret. That night, with the storm outside masking every sound, she moved closer to the man who had destroyed her people. He was older now, heavy with wine, his empire still vast, but his body vulnerable. She whispered in his own language, "For the Tangut." Then she struck. The generals would later invent other stories, illness, an accident, anything but this truth. But the women in the camps knew. They passed the whisper from tent to tent. The great Khan had fallen not to soldiers, but to a girl he thought he owned. The death of Genghis Khan could be hidden, but the life he lived could not. For behind every conquest lay another kind of violence, one that did not end on the battlefield. To understand his empire, we must begin with his own wound. As a boy, Temujin, the future Khan, watched his father poisoned and his family cast out. His mother, left alone with 7 children, endured humiliation to keep them alive. Food was scarce, loyalty scarcer. From that hunger grew an obsession. Power meant survival, and weakness meant ruin. When he rose to command, Genghis did not simply defeat enemies. He erased their bloodlines. Cities that resisted were slaughtered, and women were seized as part of victory. To the Mongols, this was not a crime, but a rite of conquest. The Khan himself set the example. He took wives from every tribe he defeated, not just for desire, but to weave their blood into his. It was said that Genghis had hundreds of consorts, each a symbol of a people absorbed into his rule. To his men, this behavior was celebrated. To the women, it was survival. Their bodies became a political frontier where the empire expanded without swords. Historians estimate that 1 in every 200 men alive today carries his genetic mark. His power spread not only through war, but through the intimacy he forced upon nations. This was Genghis Khan's most enduring conquest, one carved not into maps, but into flesh. Genghis Khan's tent was not only a command post, it was a theater of politics, where marriages became weapons sharper than steel. At the top stood Berta, his first and most respected wife. She had been with him since his youth before he was Khan. Her sons carried the highest claim to rule. But even she was not spared from the harsh reality. Berta herself had once been abducted by rivals, returned only after months in captivity. To Genghis, that wound never healed, and it shaped his ruthless obsession with controlling women as symbols of honor and loyalty. Beyond Berti, dozens of secondary wives filled the Khan's world. Some were taken willingly to secure alliances. Most were seized after cities fell. Each woman represented a conquered tribe, their forced union a political statement. To resist him meant condemning one's family to ruin. To submit meant survival under his shadow. Concubines formed the second circle, hundreds of women drawn from across the empire. Few had names that survived the records, yet their fates were sealed in silence. They were gifts from generals, hostages from rival courts, or war captives turned into living tokens of submission. In this system, love was absent. Desire mattered less than domination. By possessing the women of defeated peoples, Genghis Khan declared ownership of their future. His generals imitated him until the entire Mongol elite measured their victories not only in heads taken, but in wombs controlled. The Mongol Empire did not expand only with cavalry and fire. It spread through bloodlines, through the quiet violence inside tents and palaces. Genghis Khan understood this better than any ruler of his age. To control a people, you must also control their women. After a city fell, soldiers would seize, plunder livestock and captives. But the Khan alone reserved the most precious prize: the daughters and wives of rulers. By claiming them, he symbolically erased dynasties and declared their blood now belonged to him. In a world where lineage was power, this act was more devastating than death. The conquered women became mothers of new lineages, each child a living banner of Mongol supremacy. Some were raised in the steppe tradition, taught loyalty to the empire above all else. Others were kept hidden, their offspring reminders of a union no one dared to speak of. This system rippled outward. Mongol generals followed their leaders' example, marrying or seizing women from Persia, China, and Rus. The empire grew not just across maps, but across generations. Entire noble families were absorbed through forced unions, their identities dissolved into Mongol heritage. To the outside world, this made the Mongols terrifying. They were not only invaders of land, but intruders into the most intimate spaces of life. Their conquest did not end with the walls of a city, it continued in bedrooms, in blood, and in memory. The chronicles of the Mongol Empire rarely mention women's words. They are present in the margins as captives, as wives, as mothers, but almost never as voices. This silence is not an accident. It is the clearest sign of how deeply their lives were controlled. We know of Borta because she was Khan's first wife, her sons destined to inherit power. We know of Toragin and Sorghaghtani widows who briefly ruled after their husbands' deaths. But for the thousands of others, there are no stories. Their names vanish as if they never lived. Yet silence does not mean absence. Archaeology and scattered reports tell us of women moved across continents, from Chinese princesses to Persian nobles, from Turkic maidens to Slavic captives. Their bodies carried the weight of empire, yet their feelings, their resistance, their despair were erased by the chroniclers who served the victors. This erasure itself was a weapon. By stripping women of individuality, the Mongol machine reduced them to symbols, trophies of conquest, vessels of lineage, tokens of submission. Their humanity was swallowed by the empire's hunger. And here lies the greatest cruelty. Even in death, women were remembered only through the men who possessed them. The empire's story was written in their flesh, but never in their words. What remains for us today is a haunting emptiness, a silence that speaks louder than chronicles ever could. For the Mongols, sex was not only an act of desire, it was a calculated weapon. After a city surrendered, the Khan's men did not simply plunder, they staged terror. Captives were paraded families, broken women, taken in plain sight. These acts were not hidden crimes, but public rituals of domination. To resist was useless, to submit was survival. Genghis Khan himself turned sexuality into a theater of fear. By claiming the wives and daughters of defeated rulers, he demonstrated that no lineage was untouchable. His men followed, repeating the pattern until it became a custom of conquest. The message was unmistakable. Mongol victory meant not only the fall of walls, but the invasion of bloodlines. Fear magnified this power. Stories spread faster than armies, warning that surrender might spare a city from massacre, but never from humiliation. In some cases, women were spared execution only to be forced into the Khan's household or gifted to generals as rewards. These rituals fused sex, politics, and violence into a single machinery of empire. What made it most devastating was its consistency. From China to Persia, from the steppes of Rus to the deserts of Khwarezm, the ritual repeated: conquer, claim, erase. It was a cycle as relentless as the gallop of their horses. In this, the Mongols taught the world a lesson in terror. Conquest was not finished with the sword. It continued in the night, behind the curtains of a tent, where flesh itself became the battlefield. Centuries after Genghis Khan's death, his presence lingers not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the veins of millions. Genetic studies reveal that nearly 1 in 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome traceable to him. It is a legacy not of love, but of relentless expansion through conquest and possession. Each campaign brought new unions, many forced, some political, others ritualized, as offerings of loyalty. For the Khan, fatherhood was not private but imperial. His sons and grandsons became extensions of his power, planted like seeds across Asia and beyond. Lineage became a weapon as enduring as the bow. The numbers themselves are staggering. From the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Central Asia, from Persia to the edges of Eastern Europe, the Khan's bloodlines spread like wildfire. They were not the product of a few marriages, but of countless coerced encounters, multiplied through generations. Yet this legacy raises haunting questions. When we say millions descend from Genghis Khan, what are we really acknowledging? Is it the triumph of his empire, or the silence of women whose bodies became unwilling vessels of history? The genetic echo is celebrated in statistics, but behind each strand of DNA lies a story, never told, a cry, never recorded. In this way, the Khan achieved immortality, not through temples, not through books, but through blood. His empire may have collapsed, but his shadow walks the earth inside the bodies of the living. A legacy written not in ink, but in flesh. History remembers Genghis Khan as a conqueror, a strategist, a man who united the steppes and carved the largest empire the world had ever seen. But beneath the chronicles of victories and maps of conquest lies another story, one written in silence. The silence of women whose names never appear, whose cries were never recorded, whose lives were consumed to feed an empire's hunger. His sexual practices were not private sins. They were instruments of rule. They destroyed dynasties, erased lineages, and replaced them with his own. They turned fear into obedience, and obedience into empire. And yet this side of history rarely finds its way into textbooks. It is easier to admire the tactics of war than to confront the intimate brutality that followed. The true price of Genghis Khan's power was not measured only in the millions who died on the battlefield, but in generations forced to carry his blood, his name, and his silence. Even today, his legacy flows in millions of descendants, a living reminder that conquest does not always end with swords or treaties. Sometimes it continues in the quiet survival of those who had no choice. To remember Genghis Khan only as a warrior is to forget half the story. His empire was not built solely on horses and arrows, but on bodies and blood. And if history teaches us anything, it is this: the greatest power can leave the deepest scars invisible, yet unhealed, carried across centuries. Genghis Khan's horrors were not unique to him alone. Across civilizations, from the courts of Rome to the palaces of China, from the harems of Ottoman sultans to the campaigns of European conquerors, sexual dominance has often been wielded as a hidden weapon of rule. What makes the Khan stand apart is not the act itself, but the scale, the way he transformed private violation into public strategy, multiplying it until it became a force of empire. By examining his practices, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is filled with silenced voices, and power has often been written on the most intimate parts of human life. Wars are remembered in battles and treaties, yet their aftermath is often inscribed on the bodies of women and children, forgotten by the chronicles, but alive in oral memory and cultural trauma. The echoes of this can still be felt today. When we speak of conquest, empire, or dominance, we must also ask, at what human cost? For the Khan, each encounter may have been forgotten the next day, but its consequences stretched across generations. His story reminds us that power is never just about borders. It is about control over lives' choices, and even the future itself. To study him is not only to learn about a man, but about the recurring shadow of empire itself, one that returns whenever conquest forgets humanity. Genghis Khan's story is not only about the past. It forces us to recognize how easily power can twist human intimacy into another battlefield. His empire may have fallen centuries ago, but the logic behind it, the use of fear, domination, and silence, has not disappeared. We see echoes of it in modern conflicts where sexual violence is still used as a weapon of war. The tools may have changed, but the strategy remains chillingly familiar. What can we learn from this first? That greatness built on suffering is never complete. To admire the Khan only as a brilliant general is to erase the cost borne by millions. Second, that silence is dangerous. When stories of the vulnerable are ignored, the cycle continues unchecked. And finally, that history is not just about remembering victories, it is about listening to those who were never allowed to speak. The Mongol Empire may be long gone, but the lessons remain urgent. If we want a future where power does not rely on fear, where conquest is not written on human bodies, then we must be willing to confront these darker truths. Genghis Khan's legacy is both awe-inspiring and horrifying, and perhaps the greatest lesson he leaves us is that the measure of true power is not in how much you can take, but in how much humanity you choose to preserve.